After a successful but chaotic attack on a Confederate camp at Belmont, Grant's troops were disorganized, and the enemy was regrouping. While checking on his wounded, Grant found himself alone, cut off from his transports by a resurgent Confederate force. This is his first-hand account of his narrow escape. November 1861. One man, one horse, one plank of wood between him and capture. He rides down the bank. The transport is already pulling away. He puts the horse at the single gangplank and goes aboard at a walk. That man will accept the surrender of the Confederate armies 3.5 years later. And 24 years after that, he sits in a house in New York with cancer eating through his throat, racing a pencil against his own death. He cannot speak above a whisper. He is writing to keep his family out of poverty. And he does not start with Belmont. He does not start with Vicksburg or Shiloh or Appomattox. He starts with a ship called the Mary and John in the year 1630. He starts with a tanner's boy in Ohio who owned 6 months of schooling in his entire life. Before the general, there is the family that made him, and Grant tells it plain, because plain is all he has left. This is not a history lesson. This is his private memoir.
Arc 1. The Ship. Mary and John. My family is American, and has been for generations in all its branches, direct and collateral. I set that down first, because it is the first true thing about me, and because a man who is running short of time should say the true things early. Matthew Grant, the founder of the branch in America of which I am a descendant, reached Dorchester, Massachusetts, in May 1630. He came from Dorchester in England on the ship Mary and John, and he came as a married man, though his children were all born in this country. In 1635 he moved to what is now Windsor, Connecticut. There he was the surveyor for that colony for more than 40 years. Consider that for a moment. 40 years of measuring other men's fields with a chain and a compass, walking the boundary of every quarrel, driving the stake that settled it, and writing the figure down in a book that outlived him. He was also, for many years of that same time, the town clerk, so the man kept the records of the living and the dead in a settlement he had helped to lay out with his own boots. That is what my line begins with. Not a sword, not a title, but a chain, a compass, and a clerk's steady hand. His eldest son, Samuel, took lands on the east side of the Connecticut River, opposite Windsor. Those lands have been held and occupied by descendants of his to this day. To this day. I write that in my 63rd year, and it is still true, which is more than can be said of most things a man believes about his family. I am of the 8th generation from Matthew Grant, and the 7th from Samuel. 8 generations is not a long time when you say it. It is a long time when you walk it. Matthew Grant's first wife died a few years after their settlement in Windsor. He soon after married the widow Rockwell, and here is the part of the story I have always liked best. She, with her first husband, had been fellow passengers with him and his first wife on the ship Mary and John, out of Dorchester, England, in 1630. 4 people in the same crowded hold, on the same crossing, in the same year. 2 marriages carried aboard, and 2 of those 4 left widowed on the far shore, and joined. The ocean shuffled them and dealt them out again. Mrs. Rockwell had several children by her first marriage, and others by her second. And by intermarriage, 2 or 3 generations later, I am descended from both of the wives of Matthew Grant. Both of them, the woman who died in Windsor, and the woman who buried a husband on the same voyage. I carry them both. That is the New England of it. Land held, records kept, boundaries walked, and blood folded back on itself in a small town where everyone had come over on the same few ships. But the Grants did not stay clerks and surveyors. In the 5th descending generation, 2 brothers of my name put on the red coat of the English army, and neither of them came home. Arc 2, 2 commissions, and a widower's road west. In the 5th descending generation, my great-grandfather, Noah Grant, and his younger brother, Solomon, held commissions in the English army in 1756, in the war against the French and Indians. Both were killed that year. Both in the same year. 2 commissions, 2 brothers, 1 season of campaigning, and the name goes forward only because a boy was left behind at home. My grandfather, also named Noah, was then but 9 years old. 9. He would have known his father chiefly as a man who left, and then as a report brought home by strangers. 19 years pass, and at the breaking out of the War of the Revolution, after the battles of Concord and Lexington, that same boy, grown, went with a Connecticut company to join the Continental Army. He was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Think of what that means in a family. The father dies in the king's uniform in 1756. The son is firing at the king's uniform in 1775 on a hill above Boston. He served until the fall of Yorktown, that is, through the entire Revolutionary War. 6 years and more of it. He must, however, have been on furlough part of the time, as I believe most of the soldiers of that period were, for he married in Connecticut during the war, had 2 children, and was a widower at the close of it. That is the whole of a man's private life, compressed into 1 sentence of an old book. Married, 2 children, a widower. The war ends, and he is standing in a dooryard with a shovel and 2 motherless boys. Soon after this, he emigrated to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and settled near the town of Greensburg in that county. He took with him the younger of his 2 children, Peter Grant. The elder, Solomon, remained with his relatives in Connecticut until old enough to do for himself, and then he emigrated to the British West Indies. So the family divides at the Alleghenies. 1 son goes west into the woods with his father. The other goes south into the Cane Islands, and out of the story. Not long after his settlement in Pennsylvania, my grandfather, Captain Noah Grant, married a Miss Kelly, and in 1799 he emigrated again, this time to Ohio, and settled where the town of Deerfield now stands. He had now 5 children, including Peter, a son by his first marriage. My father, Jesse R. Grant, was the second child, the oldest son by that second marriage. Peter Grant went early to Maysville, Kentucky, where he was very prosperous. He married, had a family of 9 children, and was drowned at the mouth of the Kanawha River, Virginia, in 1825, being at the time one of the wealthy men of the West. One of the wealthy men of the West, and the river took him anyway. That is a thing you learn early, living along the Ohio. The water does not care what a man is worth. My grandmother Grant died in 1805, leaving 7 children. This broke up the family. 4 words. This broke up the family. Captain Noah Grant was not thrifty in the way of laying up stores on earth. He had fought 2 wars for other men's ground, and had little of his own to leave. And so, after the death of his second wife, he went with the 2 youngest children to live with his son Peter in Maysville. The rest of the family found homes in the neighborhood of Deerfield. My father, the oldest son, 11 years old and now nobody's charge, was taken into the family of Judge Todd, the father of the late Governor Todd of Ohio. He walked into a stranger's house with what he could carry. What he found there, he never stopped talking about for the rest of his life. Arc 3. The Tanner's Boy and John Brown. His industry and independence of character were such that I imagine his labor compensated fully for the expense of his maintenance. He was not a boy who could bear being kept. There must have been a cordiality in his welcome into the Todd family, for to the day of his death he looked upon Judge Todd and his wife with all the reverence he could have felt if they had been parents instead of benefactors. I have often heard him speak of Mrs. Todd as the most admirable woman he had ever known. My father was a man of decided opinions, and he did not hand out praise like that twice. He remained with the Todd family only a few years, until he was old enough to learn a trade. He went first, I believe, with his half-brother, Peter Grant, who, though not a tanner himself, owned a tannery in Maysville, Kentucky. Here he learned his trade. Understand what that trade is before you picture it romantically. A tannery is bark and lime and vats sunk in the ground. It is hides and hair and the smell that never leaves your clothes. It is standing in it for years until you can judge a leather by the feel of your thumb. In a few years he returned to Deerfield and worked for and lived in the family of a Mr. Brown, the father of John Brown, whose body lies mouldering in the grave, while his soul goes marching on. I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events at Harper's Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but my father knew him afterwards as a man. And this was my father's judgment of him, given plainly, as he gave everything, that he was a man of great purity of character, of high moral and physical courage, but a fanatic and an extremist in whatever he advocated. I will add my own word to my father's, and it is not a kind one. It was certainly the act of an insane man to attempt the invasion of the South and the overthrow of slavery, with less than 20 men. Less than 20 men, against a section of a continent. I have spent 4 years learning exactly what it takes to overthrow slavery in that country, and I can tell you the figure was not 20. My father set up for himself in business, establishing a tannery at Ravenna, the county seat of Portage County. His own vats, his own bark, his own name over the door. At last, in a few years he removed from Ravenna and set up the same business at Point Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio, on the north bank of the Ohio River. And that is where he was, a tanner in a 2-room house by the water, when the rest of this begins. But there is one more thing about my father you must know first, and it is the thing I most admire in him. He had 6 months of schooling in his life. 6. And he made himself a scholar anyway. Arc 4. 6 months of school, and the widows at Windsor. During the minority of my father, the West afforded but poor facilities for the most opulent of the youth to acquire an education, and the majority were dependent almost exclusively upon their own exertions for whatever learning they obtained. I have often heard him say that his time at school was limited to 6 months when he was very young, too young indeed to learn much or to appreciate the advantages of an education, and to a quarter's schooling afterwards, a quarter X about 3 months, probably while he was living with Judge Todd. But his thirst for education was intense. That is the word I choose, and I do not withdraw it. Intense. He learned rapidly, and was a constant reader up to the day of his death, in his 80th year. Books were scarce in the Western Reserve during his youth, but he read every book he could borrow in the neighborhood where he lived. And this scarcity gave him the early habit of studying everything he read, so that when he got through with a book, he knew everything in it. That is the whole secret, and it is not a secret at all. He had few books, so he finished them completely. The habit continued through life, even after reading the daily papers, which he never neglected. He could give all the important information they contained. He made himself an excellent English scholar, and before he was 20 years of age, he was a constant contributor to Western newspapers. He was also, from that time until he was 50 years old, an able debater in the societies for that purpose, which were common in the West at that time. A tanner with 6 months of school, standing up in a lyceum hall to argue in front of lawyers, and holding his ground for 30 years. He always took an active part in politics, but was never a candidate for office, except, I believe, that he was the first mayor of Georgetown. He supported Jackson for the presidency, but he was a Whig and a great admirer of Henry Clay, and he never voted for any other Democrat for high office after Jackson. Now, I will tell you the story of my father that I remember best, because I was a boy of 10 or 11 years old when it happened, and because it tells you what he was. My mother's family took no interest in genealogy, but my father took a great interest in the subject, and in his researches he found that there was an entailed estate in Windsor, Connecticut, belonging to the family. An entailed estate equals land legally locked to one line of heirs, to which his nephew, Lawson Grant, still living, was the heir. He was so much interested in the subject that he got his nephew to empower him to act in the matter, and in 1832 or 1833 he went to Windsor, proved the title beyond dispute, and perfected the claim of the owners for a consideration, $3,000, I think. $3,000 in the 1830s, brought back to a tanner's family in Ohio. That was money that could change a household. I remember the circumstance well, and I remember, too, hearing him say on his return that he found some widows living on the property, who had little or nothing beyond their homes. From these he refused to receive any recompense. He was a hard man in a bargain, my father, and he was a proud man, and he wrote letters to newspapers about his own son when he ought to have kept still. But he came home from Windsor without the widow's money, and he told his children so. That was my father's side. Now the other side, and the other side, kept no records at all. Arc 5. My mother's people. My mother's family lived in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, for several generations. I have little information about her ancestors. Her family took no interest in genealogy, so that my grandfather, who died when I was 16 years old, knew only back to his grandfather. There is a whole way of living in that sentence. Some families keep the book. Some families simply go on. My mother's father, John Simpson, moved from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, to Clermont County, Ohio, about the year 1819, taking with him his 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son. My mother, Hannah Simpson, was the 3rd of these children, and was then over 20 years of age. She came west a grown woman, not a child, and she came to a county where a young tanner from Deerfield had just set up his vats. Her oldest sister was at that time married and had several children. She still lives in Clermont County at this writing, October 5th, 1884, and is over 90 years of age. I write these words in the autumn of 1884, and my aunt, who was born before this country had a constitution, is alive. And I am the one who is dying. That is how it arranges itself sometimes. Until her memory failed her a few years ago, she thought the country ruined beyond recovery when the Democratic Party lost control in 1860. Her family, which was large, inherited her views, with the exception of 1 son, who settled in Kentucky before the war. He was the only one of her children who entered the volunteer service to suppress the rebellion. 1 out of a large family, my own blood, my own county, and 1 man out of that house in uniform. People who did not live through it imagine the North rose as one. It did not. It rose 1 kitchen at a time, and sometimes it did not rise at all. Her brother, next of age, and now past 88, is also still living in Clermont County, within a few miles of the old homestead, and is as active in mind as ever. He was a supporter of the government during the war, and he remains a firm believer that national success by the Democratic Party means irretrievable ruin. They were plain people, and they held their politics the way they held their land, with both hands, and forever. In June 1821, my father, Jesse R. Grant, married Hannah Simpson, the tanner who had 6 months of schooling and burned candles down over borrowed books, and the quiet woman whose people kept no record of themselves at all. Between them, my whole inheritance. I was born on the 27th of April, 1822, at Point Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio, in a small house within sound of the Ohio River, in a county my mother had come to as a grown woman only 3 years before. In the fall of 1823, we moved to Georgetown, the county seat of Brown, the adjoining county east, and that place remained my home until, at the age of 17, in 1839, I went to West Point, 16 years in Georgetown, and if you want to know what those 16 years taught me in a schoolroom, I can tell you, and it will not take long. Arc 6. Reading, Writing, Arithmetic. The schools at the time of which I write were very indifferent. There were no free schools, and none in which the scholars were classified. They were all supported by subscription. Subscription school yield parents paid the teacher directly per pupil. And a single teacher, who was often a man or a woman incapable of teaching much, even if they imparted all they knew, would have 30 or 40 scholars, male and female, from the infant learning the ABCs up to the young lady of 18 and the boy of 20, all in the one room, all studying the highest branches taught. And the highest branches taught were the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. That is the whole curriculum of my boyhood. I never saw an algebra or other mathematical work higher than the arithmetic in Georgetown, until after I was appointed to West Point. I then bought a work on algebra in Cincinnati. But having no teacher, it was Greek to me. I carried it home and opened it and closed it again, and it told me nothing. That is the boy who went to the United States Military Academy. Bear that in mind when the story reaches the mathematics of the place. My life in Georgetown was uneventful. I will not dress it up for you. From the age of 5 or 6 until 17, I attended the subscription schools of the village, with 2 exceptions, the winters of 1836 and 37, and 1838 and 39. The former period was spent in Maysville, Kentucky, attending the school of Richardson and Rand, the latter in Ripley, Ohio, at a private school. I was not studious in habit, and probably did not make progress enough to compensate for the outlay for board and tuition. My father paid to send me across the river to be improved, and I am not certain I was improved. At all events, both winters were spent in going over the same old arithmetic which I knew every word of before, and in repeating, "A noun is the name of a thing," which I had also heard my Georgetown teachers repeat, until I had come to believe it. I set that down as a joke, and it is one. But it is also the plain truth about the education of a Western boy in the 1830s. We were taught to say things until we believed them. But I cast no reflections upon my old teacher, Richardson. He had 30 or 40 of us, of every age and every level, and one room, and a stove, and a switch. What he could do, he did. And I say this next thing carefully, because I am a man who was made a general and a president out of that room. There was nothing in those schools to mark me out. Nothing. No algebra. No classification. No library beyond what could be borrowed in a neighborhood. A tanner's boy who did not care for the tannery, going over the same arithmetic for the 3rd winter running. And yet that school in Maysville was not a nothing. It turned out men. I sat on those benches with boys whose names went to Washington, and I will tell you who they were.
He is 62 years old. He has a cancer in his throat that will kill him within the year. And he is spending what voice he has left on a tannery in Deerfield, a schoolmaster named Richardson, and a noun being the name of a thing. Because that is where he says it starts. Not at Belmont. Not at Appomattox. In a one-room school with 40 pupils and no algebra, and in the very next lines, Grant names the boys who sat in that room with him. 2 of his contemporaries, who, he believed, never attended any other institution of learning in their lives, and who went on to hold seats in Congress and high offices besides. Wadsworth, Brewster. Then he turns the page and starts on his father's money. How comfortable the family really was, considering the times, the place, and the community in which he lived. And what a comfortable tanner in Georgetown, Ohio, expected of a son who hated the smell of hides. He would not stay in that yard, but the road out of it ran through his father's plans for him first, and the next chapter opens on the bark heaps of Georgetown,